Yes, good morning, Metal. And thank you, Ken. I've been attending your events for how many years now?
15.
What's up, Bebop? There we go. Yeah, well, how many of you own cryptocurrency? How many of you own Bitcoin? Like kind of going back, okay, well, I guess this community's been hearing a lot of talks from not just me, but others. But today's a very special day for, well, today is the beginning of something extraordinary. I like to say it's a new dawn, the beginning of a new age. But we're going to jump quickly into the market for what's happening here. This is going to show you all the ICOs or token generation events that have occurred over the last few years. So I was one of the founders of Mastercoin, which was in August of 2013, which is before the map begins. This was the first ICO. We designed the model some time ago, and for a while it didn't really take off, because if you were someone building something in the space, you much preferred venture capital. It wasn't until the DAO happened, post-Ethereum, where the model scaled, where entrepreneurs said, I'm better off doing this than I am taking money from Andreessen Horowitz, because they're like, this scales far better. And it takes a few months for the market to basically recognize this and actually roll out product. But what's happened since then is rather extraordinary for those that have been following. This speaks for itself.
That's all in 6 months.
Yeah. And so you're getting to some kind of, well, this is the end of venture capital. I mean, I don't know who would be foolish enough to take a term sheet anymore at a late stage. It's still good for maybe a seed financing, potentially an A, but there is no more late stage venture. Series B and up is done. It's either you go public or you tokenize. And this is continuing to go. This is an interesting data point when you look at that same information, but by geography. EOS, by the way, shouldn't be in the US. It's not a US entity. This is clearly inaccurate. But it is interesting, just looking at EOS, how much bigger it is than Russia, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Singapore. Interesting that Telegram is listed at stateless, but, and by the way, the Petro thing is not real. That's, government scam, basically. This shows you that same chart. But, how many of you were in the internet in 1999, 2000? Definitely interesting times. It feels certainly a little bit like that. But you never know when people talk about things being a bubble. You're looking at, 400, billion of market cap in crypto. When the internet happened at its peak, it got to 6.7 trillion. That is not inflation adjusted, and that's US, kind of Western world only. If this was a global phenomenon and you adjusted it for inflation, I think I could make a strong argument that it's 50 to 100 trillion. So when you start looking at the bubble, obviously there's going to be many cycles. You're going to see ups and downs over time, but it's still very, very small. It's still early days relative to the internet in 1999. A number of deals are interesting in the area as well. You can see that the capital coming in is increasing. But what you'll see is that you're not seeing the number of deals increase. What's happening is you're seeing a flight to quality. And so what you're doing is you're seeing larger deals. And you're going to be seeing probably less and less smaller deals. This is interesting. How many of you know the difference between what's called a utility token and a security token? Okay. This is kind of one of the key nuances in the space. Most of the token offerings that have been done, well, the first security token in the world was done in April of last year, which I did as well with BCAP. It was tokenizing our third fund. But prior to that, this had never happened. Everything had been a utility token, and this was the idea that you're saying that my token is not a security, from an SEC sort of perspective. We've designed it so that the token has utility. It looks more like a gift card, or it's gas to run on the system, or something of that nature. There's a number of ways to work around that. I said in many cases, I don't think that this is the right architecture. Clearly, if you're a foundational sort of blockchain at the protocol level, it makes a lot of sense as you start moving up the stack into tool sets and ultimately applications, less and less so. But it can go both ways. You make your decision based upon what's best for your community. But I said a lot of these things should be securities. And so I spent 2 years studying the Jobs Act and then figuring out how to tokenize the first security, which obviously is what's taking off. By next year, this will surpass utility tokens as all the world's sort of stock markets disappear as they currently exist. To put that into perspective, the current stock exchanges in the world are local by nature. Even the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange are local, albeit in a big market. It runs from 9 to 4, on weekdays, and it runs on really slow, really insecure, old, expensive technology, versus something that runs 24/7 by 365, the most efficient, secure, efficient technology you've ever seen. So that's where that's going. Let's move on to EOS. But worth noting, again, Dawn Day.
Today's the day.
Yeah, so the token sale ended yesterday, and today is the beginning of the mainnet launching and the election process, which is the beginning here of the block producers. But how many of you know what the logo of EOS is called?
We all do.
Okay, it's a chestahedron. I'm assuming everybody knows what the 5 platonic solids are. I'm going to kind of move beyond this into some of these new sacred geometrical shapes, which you have obviously the chestahedron on the left. All of those surfaces are equal in space. The decatria is what you get when you cut off the corners, just some interesting connections between the heart and the earth and how they perfectly fit together, which my wife is, and a team of extraordinary women around the world are one of the candidates for a block producer. I'm actually wearing her thing right now. I think it says "Think Outside the Blocks." And her thing's called EOS, but they made the decatria inside the chestahedron their logo. So what's the big differences? How many of you know the difference between proof of work and proof of stake? So this is one of the most important things when you start to understand how the governance of these systems work. In the case of Bitcoin and many of the earlier tokens, it was using a concept known as proof of work. And that is that you would use miners. You'd have CPUs that very quickly became GPUs, then ASICs, that are trying to solve what are kind of like really complex, elastic, cryptographic puzzles, think Sudoku. And you're trying to solve these problems, but that's also the governance system. And so you have a lot of energy inefficiency, and you sometimes have a misalignment of interests. Take Bitcoin, for example, and I'm still chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation, huge advocate, and still think Bitcoin's going to go well. I'm just not going to touch on much of that today due to limited time. But you have, as a token holder, what you want might be different than what the large miners or pools want. As the chip makers and the big data centers, you sometimes have a variance, and that's why we've seen things like Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash, forking. Certainly one of the things is, we the consumers or we the users have essentially very little or no say in governance. It's all been outsourced to the miners. That's where all the governance of the network essentially resides. In the case of proof of stake, rather than having a miner or a computer doing it, your tokens are the way that you vote. So rather than having a middleman like a miner sitting in the middle, why don't you as a token holder vote your tokens? It's eliminating essentially one of the middlemen. But then, so who powers the network? How does that network get run? And that's where we get into block producers. And the difference between what EOS does and just generalized proof of stake is we learned early on that if you give all the users that have tokens the ability to vote, most of them won't, and not with any degree of regularity. And so you still need something that looks a little bit like, you need delegated officials, essentially, where people delegate their vote or a proxy in the stock markets to someone that will then make those decisions on your behalf, because most people don't want to have to stay abreast of every election as it's happening all the time. And so proof of stake could, in most instances, very rarely got enough consensus reached to actually do anything, and that's where delegated proof of stake works. Again, you're delegating your vote or your proxy, and EOS runs on that system. I thought this was a neat little image, which is the EOS software introduces a new blockchain architecture designed to enable vertical system-like construct upon which applications